Did anybody lose their phone's coverage earlier?
I did not. What company do you go through?
A lot of people from AT&T, lost. I lost mine it came back at 1 o'clock or something like that. I lost it for a good little while. All right, we'll go ahead and get started here. Hopefully this goes okay. I still don't feel great. Um, so the exams went really good. The average was around 87, the max 100, low 70. The median, someone made 88, 89 right there at the median. I guess that would be number 10, 11, or whatever on that. You can see most of the biggest weight was between like 85 and 90, like with the grades. All right. So, the first exam, we kind of covered some monetary theory and we got into cryptography, to kind of show like, that's how, the security, how it's maintained with cryptocurrency. Now what we're going to do, we're going to kind of go into like looking at the blockchain, what all goes into it. And so we'll start out by looking at how transactions are made, like, what information goes onto the blockchain. Okay. Um, then from there, we'll kind of talk about how the proof of work algorithm kind of brings all this stuff together. And then we'll show how, like, how this is secure as long as, you don't have more than 50% of the miners coordinating together, you don't have to worry about any type of attack, and you can be assured that what's recorded in the ledger is actually truthful. All right, so we'll start off here looking at transactions. Here we go. All right. So one thing about Bitcoin transactions, is that I'm sorry. One thing about Bitcoin, we kind of say, oh, you think of it like a bank account, like you say, keep track of it on a ledger. It's completely different from that. It's not really kept up that way. And the reason they do that is like it makes it where you can, it makes it a lot easier. You can compress the data. And it makes it easier for like you can have mobile devices that can actually, access the blockchain, like make transactions. But the way that they kept up with it is like what's done is like, unspent transaction outputs. That's what's important here. You have this transaction output. If it hasn't been spent yet, okay, well, that tells you who owns that Bitcoin. There will be these unlocking conditions that's specified whenever someone makes a transaction or is trying to send money to someone. That says, okay, who has permission to send this? And that is this address. Whoever has a private key then create a digital signature that matches up with that can actually spend that money. Now, Ethereum, they actually do make use of what, kind of account-based ledgers and stuff like that. And the reason they do that is because they do a lot more stuff, sophisticated things like with in finance than like what Bitcoin is. Bitcoin is, it's mostly about peer-to-peer sending money, transfer from one person to the next. Whereas Bitcoin, they get, they have these smart contracts. They're a little bit more sophisticated what they do. So it requires something more of this account-based system. Okay. All right. So let's go to the basics here of a transaction. You have an input. All right. Well, you want to make a transaction, send someone to someone. Okay, we got to reference the transaction that says, okay, you have permission to send this. So there's going to be, there needs to be some sort of unspent transaction that gives you permission, your address, as long as you can provide the private key, you can actually spend it. All right. You reference that transaction that you're trying to spend now. Well, then now you need to reference your output. That's who you're sending it to. Okay. And then from there, you also need to provide the signature that you use your private key to create the signature. This proves that you're this reference address here. That has permission to send this. I'm sitting here pointing at it like y'all can see it. Sorry. So that's the input. You have your reference transaction. This will be some unspent transaction somewhere. Your reference output will be who you're trying to send it to. And then you need to provide a signature. You use your private key that's associated with the public address that this unspent transaction says has permission to send it. All right. What does the output say? Well, it just gives the amount in Satoshis, however many you want to send to this person, this output. And you need to provide this unlocking condition. Okay. What this says is, okay, now this person at this address, they can spend this money now. Sorry. I don't know who that is. Sorry about that. All right. So that's all there is to these are the basics of the transaction here. Okay, so like we said, the input, it needs to reference an unspent transaction that no one else yet hasn't been spent yet. And it needs to specify where this money is going to. And then in the input, you need to provide the digital signature created by a private key that's associated with the public address that has permission to spend it. And the output needs to include, how many Satoshis, and it also needs to provide the unlocking condition, the public key that has permission to send it. Okay. All right, so just kind of illustrate this real quick. Here's this first transaction. You have this input. It obviously has some unspent transaction amount that it has permission to send. They're sending it to this output, a given amount here. They're providing this unlocking condition. And so we go to down here, this next transaction. All right. Whoever has permission to send this, now they can spend this unspent transaction. They just need to provide, provide a digital signature created with a private key that's associated with the public address that's given as this unlocking condition on the output one here. And then they can send this money to this other person here for this other output. And that's how this kind of works here. All right. And this process just keeps going on and on. Now, as far as determining who has what money, well, all these other unspent transactions here, they're irrelevant. That's not going to be used to determine who owns what. All right. If you're trying to spend money, it needs to be on an unspent transaction. So after all these have been spent, only this person here can spend this money. If someone tries to, spend this money here associated with this transaction, they reference it. Well, it won't go through. It won't, they won't be able to double spend it. That's kind of how the simple way they keep track of who has what. It's just if you have an unspent transaction, no one's referenced it and spend it before. Well, okay, then someone can spend it as long as they provide create a digital signature with a private key that's associated with the public address here. Okay. Now let's kind of go into some of the basics of these, the types of transactions. They have these different names for it. Kind of the simple one that we kind of showed here too is what's known as forwarding. It's basically there's one input You're referencing one unspent transaction, or well, that could be more than one unspent transaction, but there's just one input here, and you're trying to, I'm sorry, yeah, it's referencing just one unspent transaction, and you want to send it to, one output. Okay, real simple. One input, one output. So let's kind of draw that real quick here. Let's go over here. Let's see. All right. So we have this. Well, it's not wanting to write on it. Dadgummit. Hold on one second. Sorry. Sometimes you have to reset this. Well, still not wanting to work. Dadgummit. Try it one more time. Sorry about this. If it doesn't work this time, I'll just have to skip this part. Let's see here. There we go. All right, sorry about that. All right, here we go. Okay. We have some unspent transaction output here. And the unlocking condition is where the public address A1, we're going to say this is a address associated with Alice. And it's for 1,000 Satoshis. All right. So she wants to send this to Bob. She wants to send 1,000 Satoshis to Bob here. All right, so what does she need to do? Well, for her input, she needs to reference this unspent transaction. And she needs to provide a digital signature using the private key associated with this address here. Okay. When she does that, that gives her permission where she can actually send it. Okay. And so she wants to transfer over 1,000 Satoshis. So on the output here, she needs to put this amount, 1,000 Satoshis. All right. And she needs to provide the unlocking condition. That is, B1, this is the address or the public key or whatever. The private key associated with this has permission to send this now. All right. And so this is a real simple example here. This is what's called a forwarding. You're referencing just one unspent transaction. You're transferring it just to one output, one address here that can spend this. And that's Bob here. He has his address B1. And now he has permission where he can send us this money here. So if Alice tries to send this again once this has been processed, well, it won't go through because this unspent transaction is now here. All right. You can only be spent once. All right. This is the way they keep track of it on the Bitcoin blockchain. All right. So let's go back. Let's see. Now we're back here. All right, so that was one type. There's another one called splitting. Here's you're taking this one unspent transaction in the input, and you're splitting it up. You're sending it to a lot of addresses here. So you're splitting them up, and you have multiple outputs here. Okay, and so these different outputs, they have different unlocking conditions. So you're sending to these different addresses here. Okay, and so now once this has been done, what was originally just one unspent transaction output is now a lot of unspent transaction outputs. It's been split up into smaller amounts and sent to different addresses here. Okay. Another one is where you have a lot of you're referencing like several or more than one different unspent transactions. But you're taking these different unspent transactions and you're aggregating them together to send to one address. Okay. So whoever this person is, they had a bunch of different transactions sent to their address, but they was all, separate unspent transactions. Now they want to send all of them, aggregate them together, and make one large transaction, and they're sending it to one address here. And so they'll take these, they'll aggregate them all together, and then at one time they can send them all at once to this output one here, whoever address they're trying to send it to. Okay. Now, you can also do what's called a combined transaction, which means aggregating, which is what's going on here. You're referencing like several unspent transactions, but you're also going to split them as well. You're taking them, you're combining them, you're aggregating them to have them all together, to combine them, and then you're splitting them up, sending them to multiple different addresses here. So that's just like a combination of both of those. There's multiple unspent transactions you're referencing, but then you're going to make these multiple new unspent transactions to several different addresses here when you do that. And before we get into that, let's look. So let me show you, like we'll go to this, I'll reference this too. One thing I wanted to do in class today, like I wanted to come in, I was going to actually go through the process of making a transaction from a hardware wallet. I'll do it when we come in Tuesday. Let's see here. Now let's go, we're going to go here. This is blockchain.com. And here it gives you like up to the minute information on these new blocks that have been added to the blockchain. Well, what happened there? Let's see. Here we go. Okay, so this one was mined on February 22nd at 3:40. Okay, this is block number 831,582. All right. As you see, it's connected to these previous blocks. Now, what I want to show here is this also keeps track of, and it has all the information here on all these different transactions that were made here that were included in this block. And so let's kind of go through here and we can show you different examples of these different types of blocks. How can I hide this right here? There we go. All right. So this first transaction here, transaction one, well, here's this address that someone was sending Bitcoin. They sent 0.048 Bitcoins. That's $2,526. They sent all this to this address right here. Okay. Well, as you see, they didn't send all of it. They left a pretty big tip. So there was about looks like a $24 tip here associated with this. There it is, the fee, the transaction fee, $23.48. So that's an example of forwarding. Here's an example of this last block. This is a case of splitting. All right. Someone they're doing one unspent transaction. They're taking it and they're splitting it up into sending to two different addresses here. Okay. So that's an example of splitting. Let's see here. Let's see if I can find a combination or a here we go. Here's an example of an aggregate where they're aggregating. They're taking several different unspent transactions, they're aggregating them together, and they're sending them to one address here. Okay. You can see $1,000 there, 47, 1450. Combine it together to send 2,500 to this address here. It looks like they gave a tip of about close to 24 bucks. And let's see if we can find a combined transaction. Here we go. Here's one. All right, so here there's several different, there's two inputs going to two different outputs here. All right. That's a small transaction right there, $7. Wow. Okay. And the tip here about 23 bucks. So the tips are pretty high right now. Pretty high amount. Okay, so this is kind of neat because it has all this different information on it. It kind of gives you up to date what's going on. And this is any node, anybody that runs a node, and it's usually like mining pools that do this. They can get all this information. It's there for anyone to see here. This is all we can see it publicly. That's what it means. Like, you know, yeah, these identities are hidden. You don't necessarily know who's behind these, but it's not like it's private. You can see these transactions being made. You don't necessarily know who they are. Okay. And there's a lot more information here too as well. That's kind of what we're going to finish the class talking about. We'll talk about all the information that goes into each of these blockchains. Okay. And one thing we'll talk about is a Merkle root. We'll come back to this in a second. Let's talk about these other things here first. All right, let's see. All right. Okay. Okay, so now let's talk about, well, what if the input and output values don't match up exactly? Well, if the output value is greater than the input value, the miners aren't going to say, well, let's just send what he has. He's good for, and we won't be able to cover the rest. No, they're not going to, they won't process it at all. It gets completely rejected. All right, so nothing's going to be sent over. If you try to send, if your output's greater than your input, you mess up by like having it where it's not exactly right. Well, none of the miners are going to process this transaction. It won't be processed on the Bitcoin network. Now, if your output value is less than your input value, that is, you have permission to spend on this transaction 2,000 satoshis, and your output only has 1,800. Well, then the miners keep the rest. They keep these difference. This is like what's known as a tip for the miners or a transaction fee. Now, what purposes these serve? Well, if you need to get your transaction processed really quick, you're going to add a higher fee. You want to make sure that all these miners pick this up. Because, if it's a transaction with higher fees associated with, the miners are going to get those first and try to process them because they want to get these fees quicker. But maybe if you're not in a hurry to get processed, you're not, you don't really care. Well, I'll just tip a little bit and it'll get processed whenever. It's not really that big of a deal. Then maybe you don't give a high tip. Now this is kind of something that's just unique to Bitcoin here, and you have what's called Bitcoin dust. That is, sometimes you can have it be with a case where, like you have to send somebody $1,000, all right? And so, but you have permission to spend like $1,001. So you send this $1,000 dollars to someone, and you send this $1 worth of Bitcoin to like another one of your addresses here. Okay. Now the problem with this is, well, even though it's only $1, and even if you try to combine all these together and aggregate them, all right, it all takes up information. And so based on like the amount of information you're trying to send, the more transactions, the more inputs, outputs, the more information it takes up, the higher fee you're going to need to send with this, because it's going to take up each blockchain can only hold a certain amount of information here. Okay, so the more inputs and outputs you have, the higher fee you're going to have to send to get it processed here. And so what can happen is, here's kind of an example of some of these fees. As you see, like around 2007, 2018, they spiked up really high. Okay, this is like in terms of Satoshis here. Or they got to where they're a good bit higher. And so if you have some of these unspent transactions that are really low, well, you have to pay a higher transaction fee than what they're actually worth. It's not, at that point, it becomes like Bitcoin dust, or coins that are lost in the like in your accounts. It's just not worth your effort. You lose it, you're not going to be able to spend it. So this is one of the kind of downsides to using this unspent transaction method here that they do here. Okay, you can end up having, if you don't work things out just right, where you have these little small amounts of Bitcoin that you can't really send because the fees are more than what they're actually worth. All right, so let's go back to this one transaction we did where Alice is sending money to Bob, and let's kind of just go through that and like kind of reiterate what I'm talking about here with the tips, and when what happens if like the transaction won't process because you're trying to spend more than you actually have. Over here. Right. Okay. Here, just like before, we had this unspent transaction. It's for 1,000 Satoshis. That's only like 50 cents, I think, something like that. And Alice, well, she's the owner of this address. She has the private key where she could send this. So here's Alice. And she wants to spend some money to Bob here. His address is B1, where she's going to send it. So we have the input. It's referencing this unspent transaction here. It's going to reference that. And she's going to create a digital signature with a private key associated with her address. And what she's trying to do, well, she's going to try to send 1,010 Satoshis. Okay. Well, what's going to happen here? Well, she's got this output. The unlocking condition is, B1. That's the public key associated with Bob here. So Bob can actually send this. Well, this isn't going to work because the input is less than the output. Okay. And so because of that, there's no transaction. Not one single Satoshi will be sent over in this case. It won't process it because Alice is messed up and is trying to send more Satoshis than she actually has permission to send here. Okay. So that won't come through. Now let's do it the other way, where the input's greater than the output. All right, so once again, we got this unspent transaction. It's for 1,000 Satoshis. and Alice has permission to send it. Okay. Well, here's the input. She's going to reference that unspent transaction, and she's going to provide a digital signature with a private key that's associated with A1. Here she's going to send 900 Satoshis. Okay. And she's sending this to Bob. And so here's our output. Right? And she's going to provide the unlocking edition. And the unlocking edition is, B1 here. This is the public key. So Bob has his private key associated with this. He'll be able to actually spin this later on. And he'll actually be able to do it this time because this time this transaction will go through. The output is actually less than the input. So what happens here? Well, these 100 Satoshis that aren't referenced here out of this, well, what did this do? She only spent 900, so there's 100 left. So what happens is these 100 Satoshis are picked up as tips from the miners that actually process this transaction. So this 100 Satoshis is the transaction fee. Okay. All right, so hopefully this kind of gives you an idea of the basics here on what goes on like with these when you're making these transactions here on the Bitcoin network. All right, where's that at? Now let's go back to here. All right, so once these transactions are they're verified, they're not immediately put on a blockchain. They get verified, and then they get put in what's known as a queue or a meme pool, where these miners can pick them up and actually add them to the blockchain. All right. So they'll go there, and if they're not picked up, if your transaction fees that you're trying to pay them isn't high enough, they may sit there and wait for a while until they eventually get picked up, and processed in the transaction here. Okay. All right. So briefly here, let's talk about that. Like we have these full nodes. They can gather all this information. They can see, all the transactions have been done in the past. They can look at everything. They can download the full ledger. They can verify transactions, and they can send this information and say, "Hey, I checked this out. This is good here," and they send it to someone else that they've added this block on a blockchain, or or so on. Okay, so they can do all these things. Now it takes like a decent sized computer or like power, a certain amount of power to be able to do this. But all right, they want us to be able to done like through like somebody with a mobile wallet. They want you to be able to like make a transaction. So you don't need to run a full node to be able to do this. You only need to be able to access a certain amount of this information. So with a wallet, you don't necessarily have to access the full node here. Okay. And same thing with a mining. Like if you're a miner, you join a mining pool, you don't have to run your own node. You use the node of the mining pools, and that way then you can pick up, these transactions from it. You don't have to run the full node when you do that. And they actually even, there's actually some, if you want to be an independent miner and take that chance that it may take forever for you to actually find one, there's actually some site that runs like a full node where you pay a little small fee, and you can use that information like for when you're trying to mine and add these blocks to get these mining rewards. All right. And so this is just what's going over here, like with the wallets. It doesn't have to run the full node to be able to do that. You can request these balances, these specific addresses. It can do that just fine. The mines don't have to do that. Each miner doesn't have to do that. They can just let the mining pool do it for them here. So that cuts out having to run a full node when they do that. All right, so let's kind of just go over this process here. So nodes, they're going to send these transactions to their peers. Each node is going to verify these received transactions. They're going to check to see if the input, what it references. If it has permission to send it, it's going to see the amount that's sent to this new output. And it's going to, check to make sure that the digital signature is associated with, the unspent transaction from the input here. Sorry. If the transaction is valid, then it's going to forward this to other nodes here. It's going to forward to everyone. And so then these transactions become part of this meme pool. And so at that point, anyone can pick them up that's running a node or a mining pool or whatever, and they can add these to the next block on the blockchain. All right. Now, as far as the miners doing these, the higher the transaction fee, the more likely they are to pick it up. They're going to pick up these. They do it based off the block size, the transaction size. Like the more inputs and outputs, well, the higher the transaction fee you're going to need to add to make sure it gets picked up. All right, because it's all based on how much information can get put inside of one block. And so it's kind of limited there. And so the more inputs and outputs you have associated with each transaction, the higher this transaction fee to get it picked up. And what happens if it don't get put on the next blockchain? Well, it just sits there and waits in the meme pool. Somebody can pick it up the next one, or it could possibly be, 10 blocks down the line or 100 blocks. It'll sit there and wait until someone picks it up and does something with it. All right. So, what I'll do now is I'll just kind of reference all this different stuff and talk about the Merkle root, and we'll go back to that website that kind of keeps track of this. Just kind of give you a basics of what all goes into a block on a blockchain. All right. So you're going to have the version. These are the rules that the blockchain is currently, following, like on the block size and like you use segregated witness or native segregate, these different rules that they have. It's going to reference this block. It's going to reference the previous block on the blockchain. Okay. So I won't get into that this lecture, but when we come back on Tuesday, I'll kind of, why this is important, why this makes this actually work. There's going to be a timestamp. This is important. This allows it where someone can't go back way in the past and kind of, if they got a lot of mining power, they can't go back and readjust and change like a lot of the previous blocks and kind of rewrite history. The threshold value, this is very important. This is what's adjusted to make sure that on average every 10 minutes a new block's added. So if a lot of mining power is added, like some new ASIC processors have been introduced on the market that allows these miners to run these hash functions a lot quicker. Well, the computational power is going to increase. Well, they'll need to adjust this, make it more difficult to keep it where like that way they'll keep from too many Bitcoins being added at once. They'll keep the inflation in check or whatever. That's how they do that. And this nonce, this is a number that's only used once. So this is a number that's actually going to be changed when you're trying to find, you're trying to create a hash from this, run it through a hash function that meets this threshold value, that has these certain properties that it needs to meet. And so when you try these out, everything else stays the same here, except for this nonce. You adjust this, and this is what you're just guessing at. You're just putting in there. And so the faster you can run these, the more likely you are to meet this threshold value and add the newest block. All right. And then lastly here, we have what's called a Merkle root. Okay, so this Merkle root, this is the way where you can take all these transactions, you can compress it down into like just a smaller amount of data, and that makes it easier for mobile devices and other things to check and to be able to reference these and see like if these transactions are actually available, whatever. It makes it where it takes less processing power to be able to do that. All right. Now the whole block, it has all these transactions on here, the block, but then it compresses down and creates this Merkle root where it makes it easier for people to go back and reference it and check it out. Right? It makes things a lot easier to do because it does this. Now let's talk about what a Merkle root is. Here's a real simple one. You have these two transactions. You put these in a hash function. It spits out a hash, and now it has, just look about the same data size as what one transaction would have. It's just like has a, some number in like hexadecimal form here. And we'll look at these in a second here on that blockchain website. Okay. Well, what about there's more than that? As you can see here, well, you have to do this process twice. There's 4 transactions. You take these 2 transactions here, compress them down into hash functions. You create this hash. Same thing with transaction 3 and 4. You run through this hash. You create this new hash. So now you have two hashes here. Well, you could compress this to even smaller amount here. So you run this through a hash function again until you get here at the bottom. It's what's called the Merkle root. Okay. And so now when you're going back and when people want to, a mobile wallet's trying to process a transaction, trying to reference a new transaction, well, it's a lot easier to access this now and do it. You don't have to like run all this data that was on here from the full block here. You can just reference this Merkle root. It makes things a lot simpler. All right. Now, what we'll do last here, this will be it because I'm going to keep you too long. What if this is an odd number? There's an odd number of transactions. This is where it's kind of, funny how it works here. But the way it works is, all right, you still want to like create a hash out of this transaction 5 here. You still want to be able to process it down until it gets down to one transaction. So let's show how that does that real quick, and we'll end on that note. All right. So let's say there's 5 transactions that's trying to be put in this blockchain, or this newest block of on the Bitcoin blockchain. So here they are. So this one, just like before, you take these 2 transactions, plug them to a hash function. It's going to create hash function 1 here. What's the data that goes into it? Well, it's these 2 transactions. All right. That's the data that goes into it. Same thing here in 3 and 4. You plug these 2 in it, it spits out AH2. And what was its input? Transaction 3 and 4. Well, what about here? Well, we want to do the same thing here. And so what we'll do is we'll just use transaction 5 twice. Okay. And that'll spit out this hash here that we'll use here. Now we want to get this down to, just one Merkle root. That way it'll shrink down the amount of data that's needed to use to access all these transactions. So we'll do this process again. So now we'll call this BH1. What does it have as its input? Well, AH1 and AH2. Well, what about here? Well, we'll do the same thing as we did previously here, except now we'll call this BH2. For its inputs, we'll just use AH3 twice. Okay. And finally, we can create our Merkle root. And this is what people will use. It makes it a lot simpler if they're going back and they're referencing something on the blockchain in the past year. And what is it created out of? Well, you take BH1, BH2, run it through this hash function, and it compresses it down finally to this Merkle root. Right? That becomes part of the blockchain that people will reference. Okay. All right, so let's go back to here real quick. And so what we'll do next class is I'll kind of review this stuff over again. And what I'm looking forward to doing is like trying to process a transaction of using my hardware wallet. We'll see how that goes. And then it may not process it right away, but like at some point it'll process it, and then we'll go and we'll look it up on the actual blockchain. We can reference where it was at and everything, but really quick. So we'll kind of, like I said, when we come back, we'll review all these different things that go into the hash function. And we'll talk about, why it's important that it has to reference the previous blockchain. But because it does this, this gives it this added layer of security that makes it really difficult to go back you can't just go back and rewrite one block. If you change something in the past, for it to match up, you have to change every block afterwards. So this makes it difficult to do. And this is all part of like making it where it's really difficult to pull off like a double spending attack. Okay. All right. Thanks for tuning in here. Hopefully I'll feel better this weekend, and I'll see y'all next Tuesday. Have a good weekend.